final session of the day, which is themed Borders. For those who just joined us, I'm thrilled to welcome you to this fourth session of our Reimagining Citizenship in South Asia conference. This conference is curated by the research consortium that we mentioned earlier, based at the Department of Politics at the University of York, and the South Asia Specialist Group of the UK Political Studies Association. I will not reintroduce myself all over again, except to say that I'm Indrajit Roy, Senior Lecturer in Global Development Politics at the University of York, and I'm going to keep shut there. This fourth session is titled Borders, and we have a stellar lineup of speakers from India, England, and the USA. Well, Germany, I think, technically at the moment, but based in, affiliated and teaching at the USA. Thank you so much for joining us, Antara, Bidisha, Noel, and Shreya. We've requested speakers to make their interventions in about 8 to 10 minutes. The format is to have all 4 presentations, one after the other, followed by comments and questions. To chair this session, we have with us Dr. Mujibur Rahman. Dr. Rahman is, of course, a co-investigator with us in this research consortium. He serves as a faculty at the Jamia Millia Central University in Delhi, with specialism in identity politics and the politics of development in South Asia. He has received his graduate training at the University of Texas in Austin, the University of Heidelberg, Germany, and the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. Among various research projects he has completed includes one on the politics of the violence in Kandhamal in Orissa, funded by the ICSSR back in 2008. But there are, of course, a number of other projects which he is involved with. So over to you, Mujib. The floor is all yours to introduce the panelists and take things forward. We can't hear you, Mujib. I think you've got to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you, Dr. Roy, for the generous introduction. And I welcome all the panelists. As you rightly mentioned, they are located in various parts of the world, from UK and Europe, and also from India. And it's an all-women panel. They're going to talk on on this very contentious and timely theme on which all of us are very keen to learn various kinds of interpretations on this particular question. I just have a quick question for you, Dr. Roy, that the Q&A would be towards the end or right after each speaker?
At the end. At the end. So all 4 speakers should present, and then we can have Q&A, which could include any thoughts you have and questions that may come from the audience.
And I'll try to be minimalist in the sense that this is the job of a moderator, unlike the job of a discussant, is less intellectual, and I'll try to be less non-intellectual in my task. So we have following speakers: Noel Mariam George, who teaches at Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, Chennai. We have Professor Antara Datta, who teaches at Royal Holloway College, London. Then we have Shreya Kaushal from University of Oxford. And then we have Biswas, who teaches at Western Washington University and also fellow in Germany, senior fellow in Duisburg, Germany. As I understand, I'm not, for the benefit of time, I'm not going to make any comment on the topic as such, but broadly, as I understood by going over the abstract, that all the speakers are trying to reflect on this particular question on the basis of the analysis of Assam movement and how the citizenship debate evolved over there, question of refugees, illegal migrants, question of refugees, particularly from 1971 war, and the Indian state response and all of that. Then how the Hindu right has given a new spin to the entire debate, or has taken advantage of it, or exploited the situations or the policies that were developed prior to their dominance in politics. And the last speaker has in fact gone a step further, who basically tries to analyze the anti-CAA protests from a global perspective, largely from the point of view of American diaspora. So this is how broadly the discussion is going to revolve around. So I will straightway invite the first speaker, Noel Mariam George. She's going to speak on citizenship and minorities, on the ambivalence of plural civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism in South Asia's eastern borderlands. So she has 10 minutes, and I will try to send an alarm, around 9 minutes or so. But yeah, I think self-disciplined, and I don't have to do that. I won't have to intervene. So Noel, please go ahead.
Yeah. Good morning, good evening, everyone. It's evening here in India. I just directly go to my presentation. I'll just share my screen. I just want to ask if I'm audible and if the screen is visible.
Yeah. Okay. You're audible and screen is visible.
Yeah. So I also wanted to just make a correction. I'm still a student. I just joined IIT Madras as a student, about last semester. So my work is still like a preliminary project in terms of understanding borders. My paper is titled Refugees, Indigeneity and the State, Citizen-Refugee Encounters in India's Ethno-Federal Constituencies. So the question I want to ask is, how useful is indigeneity as a framework to understand politics in the state of Arunachal as an inner line permit state? And specifically to ask, how do constitutional legal categories of minority identity, I specifically look at ethno-federal architecture of the Indian Constitution, are deployed in the language of tribal indigeneity, and how these questions are tied to who is deemed native, settler, and in turn citizen or refugee. I thought I'd just read in my abstract as well to give a small framework of what my presentation is about. I argue that any attempt to understand contemporary tensions in citizen and refugee encounters in South Asia's eastern borderlands, ostensibly deemed indigenous, demands a foregrounding of the unique circumstances of accommodation of these states into the Indian Union. In this context, refugee settlement as a top-down central government endeavor fuels ground-up ethnic protests against such accommodation. At the same time, ethno-federal provisions of the liberal state are strategically mobilized by citizens to articulate anti-refugee sentiments in the language of tribal indigeneity. However, what happens when refugees are seen as potential claimants of tribal citizenship status? So as I've mentioned, the chosen site is Arunachal along the inner line permit. So I look at insider outsider politics in Arunachal with three frames. First, by looking at the borders, both the internal and external. I've mentioned here the internal border, which is the inner line permit, and the history of its making as of a primitive frontier, which was later in the post-colonial state adopted through Schedule 6 in 5 areas. I examine the concept of liminal citizenship that Professor Sonika Gupta has used to understand Tibetan citizenship. I expand this concept to understand the question of Chakmas and Hedrongs in Arunachal as well. I also ask the question of who can become tribal as very important to understand citizenship debates or contestations between citizens and refugees in Arunachal. So beginning with the first frame, which is the inner line permit. The inner line permit was historically the backward tracks in the Government of India Act 1919, and it was what marked a cultural geography of primitiveness in this region. They were designated as protected enclaves, as spaces outside of the political. They disallowed non-natives from interfering or moving into these regions, and this frontierized primitiveness because the region was seen as the primitive frontier of the empire. What I'm interested in is the question of how the British government's delineation of settler and native, and the emphasis of don't go there, how it transforms into this assertion by the tribes themselves into against refugees and migrants of don't come here, which is the regions within the inner line. To contextualize this anti-refugee movement, I place this with the in 1992 and 1994, the Arunachal Legislative Assembly passed resolutions to deport refugees from the state, claiming that the presence of refugees in the region was forced into the state when it lacked electoral power and violated the promises of India's asymmetric federalism. So I've just included some of my conversation with APSU and SUMA members, and APSU members especially because APSU had initiated the Refugees Go Back movement, demands for detecting disenfranchisement and deportation of refugees from the state, questions about Arunachal not being a dumping ground, especially in the context of CAA, about how the protests against CAA was not about Hindus or Muslims, but about the rights of indigenous people. Questions of how Chakma refugees being from Bangladesh would dilute the tribals of Arunachal, and similar questions, and how questions of land and questions of how the government can give land that belongs to tribals to refugees, and similar kinds of questions. So exploring the unique circumstances of Arunachal's accommodation, Arunachal was former Northeast Frontier Agency, which was included within the Indian state much later. Arunachal is hence both paradoxically a remote borderland and a militarized frontier. The Indo-Tibetan border, I'm talking about the external border now, the Indo-Tibetan border along the McMahon line is demarcated, but it's not delimited. And since the 1962 war, the entire state of Arunachal has acquired the status of disputed territory. And even today, China does not recognize Arunachal as part of India. Another reason for these protests is the narrative of center-state relations, which often is posited as a linear imposition by the center on the state, which is that Chakmas, Hajongs, and Tibetans were settled in the Northeast Frontier Agency before it had electoral power, or before it became an actual state within the Indian Union. But I think this narrative is much more complex, because what we have with the states like Arunachal, which are ethno-federal states, is questions of asymmetric federalism, and hence a linear center-state relation or a linear imposition of settlement cannot be really drawn, though that's the larger narrative that tribal indigeneity posits. So it is in this context that the question of who can become tribal becomes very important in Arunachal, because next claim to becoming a citizen is the ST status. So the process of tribal recognition in the Indian state is quite an opaque process, which includes certification, which measures categories like indication of primitive traits, distinctive culture, like geographical isolation, shyness of contact, and all of these colonial categories of anthropological tribal difference. And these are the categories which still are required to attain an ST status. It is in this context that several citizens claim that refugees acquire fake certificates for ST status. Additionally, the fact is the ST status being a specific state-centric process, it's different in different states. It's oftentimes an arbitrary process even. Chakma and Hajongs in Manipur and Tripura have ST status, while Tibetan Muslims in West Bengal have it, while in Arunachal, both of these communities are not recognized as tribal. So it is in this context that I ask, what is tribal indigeneity? Several anthropologists have attempted to theorize this within frameworks of proto-nationalism, which is demands for sovereignty without. Okay. I also want to distinguish the fact that indigeneity in the Eastern Borderlands did not develop in response to settler colonialism, especially because indigeneity is a concept developed with white settler colonialism. It's very different notion of indigeneity that is attributed here. which is often in response to displacement, fragile borders, neoliberalism, federalism, questions of non-compliance of federalism. So indigeneity is often articulated as anxieties of citizens in such contexts rather than actual settler colonialism in the region. Specifically now with the context of the CA in 2019, several scholars have argued that the CA would ethnicize citizenship, but this does not account to the fact that ethnic provisions already exist within the constitution, especially in ethno-federal constituencies, and the induction of ethnic laws have already happened with the prior amendments. And additionally, with the states with the inner line permit, there has been an exception for the CA. The BJP has actually argued for an exception of the CA within inner line permit states, and in fact expanded the inner line permit to Manipur. So now I explore the question of Chakma, Hajong, and Tibetan refugees specifically in this context. I argue that Chakmas, Hajongs, and Tibetans exist in a question of liminal citizenship that tips towards statelessness, though not complete statelessness. Tibetans, Chakmas, and Hajongs were eligible for citizenship under Section 1A of the Indian Citizenship Act of 1955, and hence Tibetan refugees who entered before 1987 received registration certificates, and Chakma Hajongs were also eligible for citizenship. However, there's been a change of citizenship laws, especially with the 1987 amendment. So because of the non-implementation of Supreme Court judgment granting citizenship in the case of a significant number of Chakmas and Hajongs, and with regards to questions of preserving exile identity for several Tibetans, several refugees still live in a situation of, if not complete statelessness, liminal citizenship because of the India's ethno-federal architecture. So my question is to ask if indigeneity implies subalternity, because that is the larger assumption that a lot of global scholarship takes up. But I argue that provisions of positive discrimination in scheduled areas that were instituted to protect tribal communities and ensure certain legal rights over land have become, in many cases, not always though, a tool by the natives to reinforce anti-settler sentiments against groups that are also marginalized. In this case, especially groups like refugees who also tip to the point of statelessness. And it also reinforces the notion of permanent minorities, a concept that Mamdani had argued about in his recent work. So I argue that indigeneity is intrinsically not a sign of subalternity nor resistance, but needs to be seen much rather as an assertive political statement that is often deployed in the language of the state and oftentimes appropriates the language of the state. So this is pretty much, oh no, I have one more slide.
Almost 10 minutes.
Yeah, just the last slide. So I asked, what is Arunachali identity? Can we build inclusive alternatives of belonging? Mainly as I began with the presentation, how can ethno-federal provisions be maintained without the exclusion of the non-Indigenous? So I argue that the citizenship crisis involves a delicate balancing of interests of communities that claim tribal indigeneity, as well as people who underwent migration, displacement, or settlement, and who potentially might find themselves worse off than claimed indigenous people. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, in fact, sticking to the time. Our next speaker is Professor Antara Datta, who is a historian at Royal Holloway College. And she will be speaking on the topic, Locating 1971 Refugee Crisis in the Citizenship Debates. So it would be straight to Southeastern history, more specifically to Indo-Bangladesh question and Bangladesh history and all of that. So Professor Datta, the floor is yours.
Thank you for this opportunity. You've already heard about 1971 today in the context of Professor Devji's keynote lecture. And of course, if we were meeting in person and I had the opportunity to do so, I would have kind of possibly argued with Professor Devji about his kind of conceptions of humanitarianism in India's decision to go to war in 1971. I argue in my book that actually India makes a case about security, about the refugees being a source of aggression. But we'll have to stick to the online format for now. But let's talk about that 1971 refugee crisis a little bit. And what I want to argue today is that, we've been looking at some of these terrible images circulating on social media, emerging from Assam. But beyond that kind of obvious physical violence on display, the Assamese Muslims have been subjected to various forms of bureaucratic violence by the Indian state for many years. Shahana Ghosh, the anthropologist, has described this as a form of kagojer atonko, a paper monster, if you will. And this is a hazard of being a minority on that border between Bangladesh and India. So I want to argue that this is part of a bigger atonko, a bigger terror that encompasses these questions of citizenship and ties the controversy over the National Register of Citizens, the CAA, with the 1971 refugee crisis. So if we want to understand the panoply of measures that the central government introduced in order to assuage Assamese anxieties over migration, then I will argue today that 1971, for a couple of reasons, plays a key moment in those legislative interventions. So if we want to talk about the Assamese anxiety over immigration, and we've talked about it extensively in the seminar today, we can of course trace it to the colonial period and C.S. Mullin's census report about the invasion of vast hordes of land-hungry Bengali immigrants, mostly Muslims from the districts of Eastern Bengal. I quote from that census report. And he is talking about the Na Assamia, who are mostly these Muslim cultivators and laborers who then integrate into Assam. They begin to speak Assamese, they enter Assamese as their mother tongue in the census report, they send their children to Assamese medium schools. A second moment of anxiety in Assam is partition and the refugee crisis that emanates from that. And here you have a standoff between Gopinath Bordoloi and Jawaharlal Nehru, where Bordoloi refuses to take any more than 300,000 refugees, and Nehru threatens him with various forms of punitive financial action. So in the post-1947 period, you see this uneasy moment of solidarity based on linguistic affiliation between the Muslims in Assam, this Na Assamia, who side with the Hindus on the question of language, because many of them, of course, also fear deportation, particularly with the passage of the Immigration Expulsion from Assam Act of 1950. So what I want to argue next is that the night of the 25th of March, 1971, which is the night of the crackdown by the West Pakistani army in East Pakistan, particularly in Dhaka and on the campus of Dhaka University, marks an important moment in our story, because that is the moment at which refugees begin to cross the border into India. And over the next few months, tens of thousands, if not millions of refugees cross the border. The UNHCR accepts that between March and October 1971, nearly 10 million refugees cross this border, of whom roughly 8 million are Hindu, and critically for our conversation today, 2 million are Muslim. As these refugees cross the border, India's Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and India's Refugees Minister R.K. Khadilkar, the Minister for Rehabilitation, they're both keen to impress upon the people living in these border areas that these refugees are not like the partition refugees, that they will go back. But of course, this is not a rhetoric that people living in these border areas are keen to accept. And so you see the rise of what I have described elsewhere as an affective border. I know we're going to talk about affective borders in a later talk today, but as part of this affective border, some of that resentment, of course, is directed against the Bengali Hindu refugee, right? And there's sort of a fear that many of these Hindu refugees are going off to live with relatives. They're not being counted in the official refugee figures. And so at the end of the war, how are we going to round them up and send them back and so on and so forth? But this exodus into Assam is important because this is the first significant Muslim exodus into India since partition. Now, of course, there is a return of Muslim refugees from Pakistan post-1947, and Wazira Zamindar talks extensively about the ways in which the Indian state uses the permit system to try and control that. But post-1947, this is one of the most significant Muslim refugee movements into India. And when there are skirmishes between local residents and the refugees, very quickly, rather than sort of divisions based on linguistic grounds, very quickly these take on communal overtones. And you see parties like the RSS, they're very quick to jump on the case. The RSS, for instance, talks about Pakistani agents, fifth columnists, infiltrators, and saboteurs. Bipin Lal Das was a member of the Rajya Sabha from Assam. He talks about 5 lakh saboteurs amongst the refugees in Assam. So he's not talking about all the refugees in Assam. He's talking about this minority that he sees as being far more problematic than the Bengali Hindu refugees. So you see that earlier solidarity, that linguistic solidarity beginning to fracture in 1971. The second point I want to make is that that affective border then takes effective form through certain legislative means. And the first of these is the Assam Accord of 1985, which brings to an end, or sort of brings to an end, some of the unrest brewing in the Northeast. Now, what is quite unique about the Assam Accord and the Citizenship Amendment Act of 1986 that follows is that they both use that date of the 25th of March, 1971, to draw a line in the sand, a legal line in the sand, to delineate who is a refugee and who in the future will now be an illegal infiltrator. So to me, this is a really important moment. Country A, or well, what is now country A, has carried out military action in country B, but it is country C that is using that particular night to differentiate between its citizens and its non-citizens. And what that means is that anybody who came in 1971 and did not return, or actually returned and then came back to India after the assassination of Sheikh Mujib, is to be considered an illegal infiltrator. So I want to jump forward in the narrative to the NRC and the CAA and how that discourse has played out in Assam. And I want to argue that the CAA, the Citizenship Amendment Act, tried to provide a moment of, to use Anupama Roy's language, a moment of encompassment to bring the Hindu refugee into the nation state while keeping the Muslim illegal infiltrator out. And because it tries to mess with that line of 25th March 1971, you see a backlash in Assam. So for instance, in the debates taking place in Parliament, Produt Bordoloi says, moving the Lakshman Rekha of citizenship by 43 years and 9 months from 1971 to the present day will be catastrophic for his constituents. You know, Gaurav Gogoi in the same vein says the Northeast opposes this bill because we are not slaves, hum gulam nahi hain. So I want to finish, because I know I'm out of time, by suggesting that there is a longer historical trajectory to these current debates that we're having about the National Register of Citizens, the place of minorities in Assam. And of course, this debate goes back to the colonial period. But I want to make a case for arguing that for a couple of reasons, 1971 is a key moment. It is a key moment for that kind of affective fracture between Assam's Bengali Hindus between Assam's Hindus and Assamese Muslims, but it is also a key moment in which future legislative measures that are introduced recognizes that moment as a legal line in the sand to differentiate the citizen from the infiltrator. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we will move on to the next speaker, which is Shreya Kaushal from the University of Oxford, to speak on passing, reimagining boundaries in and between India and Bangladesh. I think it's hard to further on the discussion concerning Bangladesh question, Indo-Bangladesh relations.
Right. So Thank you so much for having me here. I think Professor Datta and Noel have presented such a great foundation for what I want to be suggesting here onwards. But I think I would want to start my presentation with really describing two instances that shaped the queries I attempt to grapple with today. So the first was in January 2020, when in one of our classes we were discussing the NRC-CAA protests, and Assam came up. And all of us acknowledged that the protests in the Northeast are different than the ones that we were seeing in Delhi, but we could not critically engage with that disparity. And there was just silence in the room. And it felt very wrong for us to have a say on whom certain groups already marginalized may or may not want in their states. And it felt like it wasn't our place to have or share that opinion. The second instance was earlier this year when I was listening to another conference and a speaker said something along the lines that borders are inherently anti-Indigenous. And I remember asking at that point that, then how do we make sense of borders or border technologies employed by Indigenous communities themselves? And when I brought up this question to my anthropology peers, I mentioned, because Noel mentioned anthropology before, one of them said that, oh, Shreya, this is a very controversial thing. And somehow it was implied that it was icky for me to raise that question at all. Now, I bring up these two things because it's important to understand why, for me at least, why I ask these questions, why are they important to people outside of myself, and for whom does this question matter, right? And both of these instances, I believe, go on to show how morally and affectively embedded the discourse on indigeneity and borders are in India and globally. It feels wrong to discuss, let alone question, or worse, critique the demand for detection, disenfranchisement, or deportation of an ethno-religiously identified group. And it made everyone else in the room uncomfortable, including myself. So here, when I use indigenous, for example, if I restrict it to Assam, arguably, many people have argued that the group that claims the indigenous right of exclusionary politics comes from a largely upper caste Hindu Assamese group. And which is not to say that we must discredit indigenous activism, but to rather question what it does. And often the language that is used is of passion for their country or for their land, which also translates into passion against those who seem to be infiltrating it. So what I try to understand is what this passion / indigenousness does, and how it does not necessarily discredit indigeneity or passion, but rather raises questions on who it excludes or who it leaves out. So consequently, my paper tries to understand the discomfort, the personal and political discomfort we feel when we discuss this, and how this particular silence furthers the exceptionalism and essentialism and sort of exhausticism of Northeast states. Now, I use this by a framework of passing, where I understand passing as passing through a border, passing as someone who can pass through a border, or passing as someone who passing away as someone who passed through a border and should not have. And lastly, passing laws on passing through and as a border. So I use the word passing a lot because I do think it should be emphasized in understanding how passing is not just a movement or a making of something, but also something that is morally irking, which raises questions on how passing often is seen as trespassing. Now, this is something that Rogers Brubaker argued in the sense of gender and racial passing. And he quotes that passing is always trespassing. And I want to borrow this and understand how this morally charged statement, almost an accusation, can be understood in the context of indigeneity and border politics in India, and how that shapes citizenship as we see it right now. So now, accordingly, I try to understand the border between India and Bangladesh as something that is embedded, embodied, and enacted through affect, as Professor Datta mentioned earlier. Something that does not simply exist out there, but has to be imagined, invented, and iterated incessantly through emotions. Secondly, I argue that these affective borders are neither stationary nor singular. If we think of what comprised or comprises Assam, that definition or the boundary has changed ever since the province was incorporated in the British Empire in 1826. We think of how Assam at one point was part of the Bengal province, and then another was part of East Bengal, then it became a separate province, including bits and pieces of East and West Bengal, eventually with changes in 1947, and then post 1947 with the breakup of quote-unquote tribal states coming up, right? So all of these situations, we see how borders in the region are not just multiple, but also mobile. Moreover, they stick to one another. And I use the word stick in a very affective sense, that they reproduce the logic that indeed borders must enclose an ethnically homogeneous population. So now I'll say this in a context where there are Bangladeshi prisoner women in correction homes in Kolkata asking whether India is within Bangladesh or vice versa, or where Garos across the India-Bangladesh border compared the BSF to elephants in the region, saying that both of them could be anywhere at any point. I say this in the context where bordering towns in Assam set up village defense parties to assist the BSF, or youth groups in Nagaland serve quick notices to those they suspect as Bangladeshis. So here we see how the border has moved beyond its physical demarcations as well as the state machinery. Now, given the NRC CAA, we should also recall how, for example, the Immigrants Expulsion from Assam Act of 1950 itself conferred on the newly formed government the power to deport illegal immigrants, with the exception to groups and individuals it assumed may be subjected to religious persecution in the neighboring states. Now, although this law was repealed in 1957, the very existence of the law goes on to show how even in the very first decade of an independent, secular India, the post-colonial state preferred and facilitated the mobility of some over others. So when situated within the larger history of sons of the soil conflicts in the Indian subcontinent, one finds that the CAA nor NRC are neither the first nor the last of its kind. Instead, they are an extension of equally, if not more significant, citizenship measures that have been taking place over decades, including the last two amendments in 86 and 2003. And note that the 1986 amendment comes right after the Assam Accord was signed in 1985 that concluded the anti-foreigners agitation in Assam between 1979 and 85. So looking at citizenship from the lens of indigenous and border politics along the India-Bangladesh border, I argue shows us three things. First is how far further the affective politics of borders has extended in India today. The India-Bangladesh border no longer just sticks to bodies that transgress it, but also other bodies and other borders that may be transgressed elsewhere. So whether it's the Rohingyas from Myanmar, or the Afghans from Afghanistan, or the Ahmadiyas from Pakistan, now they're all rendered sticky, that is stuck in the shared or shifted stigma of becoming the latest rendition of Bangladeshi immigrants. Now, note how the border is not only mobile and affective, but has also dispersed and distributed across the country. So it's Bangladeshis, so it threatens to strip away citizenship not only from immigrants who may pass as citizens, but also citizens who may pass as immigrants. Here we see a transference of affect and performativity to all borders, all of its crossers, and those who may be assumed to have crossed the border. This stickiness, as secondly argued, does not really imply or necessitate a sense of cohesion or community. Instead, it institutionalizes what I call as competitive precarities, where the NRC CAA further the chasm between immigrants and indigenous, or infiltrators or refugees, citizens, non-citizens, Muslims and non-Muslims. These groups are not only then pitted against each other, but also amongst themselves, largely diffusing the potential and disincentivizing the prospects of all and any collective action addressing their varyingly shared precarity. The perpetuation of competitive precarities risks denouncing the sort of idea that perhaps like staying together may be more morally challenging as compared to staying apart. And this particular idea also then furthers the silence in critiquing or conversing about this apartness in particularly power-laden dynamics. Lastly, I argue that this new growing morality that we see not just in Borderlands but outside of it now is a sort of defense against the prevalence of passing, of movement, and the potential it carries, where one can not only pass through borders but also pass as citizen, indigenous, or an infiltrator. So here we need to understand passing as a movement and a performance, as well as something that is moving across geographies and emotions, as things that bleed into one another in and beyond the borderland. So one may voluntarily or involuntarily pass through because they pass as, or pass as because they pass through. Now, it is interesting here to understand that these boundaries that one passes through / as are neither inherent nor unchanging. Rather, they constantly shape-shift to generate the distinctions they pretend are given. Now, it is the ease with which that they can be crossed, that these borders can be passed, crossed, merged, that provokes national insecurity at best and mass violence at worst. Now, this particular moral panic that we see by passing and / trespassing is what I argue furthers the increasingly exclusionary citizen politics that we've seen, not just something in the recent times furthered or aggravated by the rise of Hindu nationalism, but across history on the idea of ethnically exclusive homelands. So yes, that is what I essentially argue why we need to think about morality and affect to understand how citizenship today is just a continuation of moral and affective politics across time and space. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kausar. And now we have the last panelist, Dr. Bidisha Biswas, and she'll be speaking on who are the people of India, an examination of diaspora contestations over India's citizenship laws.
Thank you, and thank you for joining me this evening. Shreya just made a very compelling argument about how the affective border travels and how this notion of passing travels. And I guess my argument is that one end of that spectrum, because I'm talking about how the affective border has traveled to the diaspora. So I'll begin my journey in February 2020, when the world was a different place and people could congregate in large numbers. At that time, I was in the city of Seattle, which is in the west coast of the US, and it has a pretty large Indian population. And in February, the Seattle City Council, which is the local council that usually deals with city matters, policing, etc., actually met to discuss a resolution that condemned the CIA and the NRC and condemned the Indian government's what it called majoritarian authoritarian policies. Now, the resolution eventually passed, and it passed unanimously, so all the city council members voted for it. And while I was watching the proceedings of the city council, what I was very intrigued by was the fact that here was a resolution that had no material standing, right? A city cannot determine US foreign policy. A city council has no jurisdiction whatsoever on this matter, on how the US should be framed. Yet that day, the city council was filled with Indians and Indian origin persons on both sides of the debate, pro-CAA NRC, anti-CAA NRC. The city council, the main room was full, it was packed to capacity, so they opened an overflow room, and that room was packed to capacity. And so the crowds were, they were lined up outside, they were on the stairs, they were all over the building, they were outside the building. And I just thought to myself, why are they here? What are they hoping to achieve, right? On the one hand, what is one side of that debate hoping to achieve by having this non-binding resolution passed? And on the other hand, why are there all these activists saying, do not pass this resolution? It is an insult to India. It is an insult to us as the diaspora. And why is it that even the Embassy of India got involved, wrote a letter to the mayor of Seattle, and so on and so forth? And then I found out that in the months since then, at least 6 other US cities passed a similar resolution, and some others, similar resolutions failed. And so I set out on this research to understand what was going on. And I interviewed activists, I looked at documentation, I looked at city council records. And so I'll just share with you very briefly what it is that I found. Now on the anti-CAA NRC side, so the side that I'll call the pluralistic Indian diaspora, there was a very keen awareness that these city council resolutions would not make a material difference. But that section of the diaspora felt it was very, very important to make a normative statement about what citizenship of India means to them, even though they no longer live in India. And what I thought was really interesting is that many of them, when talking about their motivations, actually referred to the Indian Constitution. And this was, of course, derived from the fact that many of the protesters within India were also talking about the Indian Constitution. One activist, for example, said, those who wrote our Constitution, they represented India's greatest generation, and we have to find a way to commemorate them. Another said that I'd never thought about what it meant to be a citizen of India till this whole thing happened. And then I went back and read the preamble of the Indian Constitution, and I felt I must defend it, and so on and so forth. So multiple activists really said that it was the Constitution and it was the framers of the Constitution that inspired them. And alongside that, they were very insistent that by demanding that India stand by its secular credentials, they were defending the homegrown Indian idea of what is India, right? So there was an allegation, there were many allegations passed that the sort of secular diaspora activists did not represent India, did not understand India. They were kind of putting Western ideals on India, and they emphatically rejected that. They said the ideals of the Constitution were homegrown. They were represented by people like Ambedkar, who are very much rooted in India. And so by protecting those ideals, or by trying to protect those ideals, they were protecting what is Indian identity. And at the same time, while they were rooted in India, they were using this local forum, the forum that they had, the city of Seattle, the city of San Francisco, to send a message to three actors, to the American government, to the Indian government, and to the protesters about what their moral argument about defining the Indian state is. In 2020, of course, President Donald Trump was in power, and his views of citizenship were pretty restrictive as well. And so this particular section of the diaspora felt that by standing up for the protesters in India, they were also standing up for a global argument in favor of an expansive notion of citizenship. And so in all of this, I sort of came to the conclusion that many scholars have spoken about the fact that the Indian diaspora tends to be very conservative and tends to have a divided morality, in that they support pluralism and secularism in their adopted countries, in the US or the UK, but they don't support it in India. And this section of the diaspora emphatically rejected that. And they said that we support the ideals of India, and we see a local, national, and transnational link there. So now I'll come to the flip side, the pro-Hindutva group, I would say, and I have a confession to make. Despite very, very strong efforts, I was unable to interview even a single one of the activists on that side. They just refused to speak to me. So my methodology is a little bit and public statements and the emails that they sent to city council members. And for them, firstly, the Constitution was not relevant. They made almost no reference to it whatsoever. And that's, perhaps not surprising. In an earlier panel interview that talked about how Prime Minister Modi and others, they talk about supporting Indian democracy, which they do, but they're not big fans of the Indian Constitution. And so I think the pro-Hindutva diaspora was reflecting that. But what the diaspora was very interested in was talking about India as being a country that offers mercy. That the reason for having the CAA was that persecuted Hindus in Pakistan and Bangladesh specifically, and to a lesser extent in Afghanistan, have a need to be rescued by India. And in particular, they were very, very concerned about the welfare of women. So there were testimony after testimony after testimony about Hindu girls, Hindu women being married off to old men. They didn't say old Muslim men, but that was clearly an indication. There was a lot of talk about rape of Hindu women and Hindu girls. And so, the idea was that India is a morally superior country compared to its neighbors. And India is the country that will be the refuge to the people who need it most, which are suffering Hindus, particularly suffering Hindu girls and women. Earlier on in this conference, there was a conversation about Gharvapsi, this idea of return conversions. And as I was thinking through that, I think maybe this section of the diaspora also has a reflection of that, you know, India is the land where Hindus from South Asia should come to. They should find their way back home. Interestingly, this section of the diaspora did not say anything against Indian Muslims. They did not make any reference to infiltrators, termites, none of that. And that was perhaps in deference to the audience they were speaking to. They were speaking to US government officials who, you know, in the cities that the resolutions were brought would not view that with a lot of favor. I mean, overall, I think they were standing up for Indian sovereignty, and they were standing up for keeping Indian sovereignty firmly in the hands of the current Indian government, but also thinking, much like the pluralist diaspora, in a global sense, that Hindus need to come back to the home. And, you know, in conclusion, maybe we can talk about about this more in the Q&A, but what I felt was that in both sides, this notion of the affective border that Antara talked about, this affective border is something that the diaspora also feels very strongly. These were very emotional arguments. And almost everyone there was putting in all this time and effort into these resolutions because emotionally they felt that the citizenship debates in India identified not just India, it identified the diaspora itself. So even though they had left the territory of India, many of them had no intention of returning to live in India, that what was happening there in terms of defining who is or isn't an Indian, who deserves to be a citizen, who deserves to not be a citizen, is something that defines them as well in their adopted homes. So I'll conclude with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Biswas, for sticking to time again. We had 4 excellent presentations, and all of you, I would request Shreya also to kind of, all of you to unmute, and we would now request people to ask questions. But prior to that, I would like to take advantage of my own position and raise 2 specific questions. I haven't had the good fortune of attending other sessions as I was preoccupied with a few other prior commitments. This is the only panel and the previous panel on Afghanistan that I attended. All the panelists, as I understand, have addressed this question, keeping in mind the politics of Hindutva or Hindu right. Although that did not come out in some of the presentations, but that's what the overarching framework around which the entire discussion has taken place. My own sense is this: central to all this discussion or all the literature that has come up ever since the citizenship debate has been taking place is around the partition question. Partition, which was supposed to bring resolution to the so-called Hindu-Muslim question and the homeland question and all of that, has created a situation in which we come across that partition has become much bigger a problem than it was anticipated by the advocates as well as the critics of partition. So my question is, and this is primarily a question for historians, but I'd be certainly happy that all of us, other people could also look at it. Was there something that went wrong and has gone wrong, intellectually speaking, in the interpretation of partition? Because it is obvious now that the Hindu right has exploited to its hilt the entire partition politics, partition analysis and interpretations and all of that. Put bluntly, what partition was is this: partition was primarily an elite project on both sides. It was not a subaltern project. And that is not how it was presented to the subalterns. As a result of which, a lot of average, for instance, Muslims or non-Muslims in different parts who are not at all certain that what they're getting into, but given the circumstances they found themselves, that they just can't come back to India. When the citizenship elsewhere, say for instance in Germany, if you prove your ancestry, you can come back. In India, if you are a Bengali Muslim, you can't prove, even if you prove your ancestry that you belong to Uttar Pradesh or Karnataka, you can't come back because you are a Bangladeshi, and that is how you're perceived about it. This is one question. The other question is slightly, which is more hypothetical. But I think it is important to raise this hypothetical question to make sense of Hindutva politics and its strategy. Although in the discussions in general, Bangladesh, Assam, all the political developments that are taking place with these issues are seen as something that has led to this thing about it. And a lot of interventions made by so-called secular political parties over the years has contributed to created foundations for the Hindu right to build on it. It's not that the Hindu right did all these things from scratch, right? So once I asked this question to Shiv Shankar Menon, I said, had Nehru been alive, had he made the intervention in Bangladesh in the way Indira Gandhi did, because had Nehru gone for war, all of that. So Shiv Shankar Menon was, that's too hypothetical. So we should not ask such questions. So my question is this, my own understanding is this: given the kind of ideology on which the Hindu right or Hindutva politics is based on, regardless of what happened in partition, regardless of what happened in Bangladesh, regardless of what happened in Assam, the argument of Hindu right with respect to citizenship in any case would have stayed the way it is formulated today. Or regardless of what sort of atrocities that has happened to the minorities in Pakistan and minorities in Bangladesh. And let's accept that there are atrocities that has been taking place on both sides of the border. It's not that they are enjoying a lot of freedom or dignity over there out of it. So Hindu rights, my own position is that this Hindu right would have gone for this kind of an argument of citizenship, which is exclusionary and majoritarian and all of that stuff, regardless of all these developments about it. And all these developments, of course, Hindu right has very selectively used in order to create a moral high ground. And as Bidisha pointed out, the global diaspora is very selective, which is not painting it as termites or other thing about it. It is going away in some other direction about it. So the other two broad comments or questions that I would like to put on the table. Should we start with some comments from the panelists, or is there is a long question, a comment already in this? Should I read that out? Is there anyone who would like to comment on this?
Yeah, if you want me to comment on the tribal question. I mean, I'm not an expert on Tripura or on tribal politics, but I mean, what we know about tribal politics in India is that the marginalization of tribal groups began in the colonial period and has continued into the post-colonial period through the neoliberal state. And I think, how do liberal theorists respond to this? I think it's possible to have protection for minorities within a nation while maintaining what Bidisha described as a more pluralistic vision, right? I don't think the two are necessarily antithetical to each other. Now, what that looks like in specific border areas is harder to describe. And this is why these are sort of areas of contestation. But I think, the Indian Constitution has, at least in its kind of broad legal expanse, tried to find accommodation for various kinds of minorities while providing this broader pluralistic vision, which brings me to your question about why what the Hindu right has done and why they've been able to take advantage of this narrative. So I think yes, possibly the Hindu right's vision of citizenship would have always been the same, but the Hindu right has been able to pivot. The Hindu right has been able to take ownership of its position during partition in a way that it would have been inconceivable in the 50s and 60s. When Joya Chatterjee writes about the Bengali Hindu Bhadralok, right, pushing for partition, this comes as a surprise and as a shock to many, well, not those who live amongst the Bengali Bhadralok perhaps, but to many scholars. However, what I suspect happens post-1992 in India with the kind of majoritarian turn and then subsequently post, I would say 2009 with the kind of more overtly fascist turn in politics, is that the Hindu right is able to claim that space much more proudly. The Hindu right is able to say what, say, Aisha Jalal or Joya Chatterjee were hinting at, which is that it was the Hindus in India who pushed for partition. Suddenly, you know, what in the nationalist narrative had been seen as a moment of shame that India had to give up a portion of its territory is now seen as a victory, right? And so while if you look at the Constituent Assembly debates, there had always been those who argued for a more limited, a less inclusive vision of India. That had always been, that inclusive vision would have always been accommodated within a larger pluralistic secular framework. I would argue that the current Hindu right is able to repudiate that entirely. This is why Bidisha's respondents don't care about the Constitution, I would argue, right? Because they would be happy to tear it all up and start from scratch again. And it is that discourse, I think, that is possible today and has been possible in the last decade and would not have been possible maybe even 20 years ago. I think that's the shift. And I would argue that political parties, whether the Congress, but also, liberals on the ground, have not been able to respond to this shift. And this is why we are where we are today.
Is there anyone who would like to comment on? Noel, would you like to take on this question on the tribal question?
I think it's this question of tribal indigeneity, for instance. I'm specifically arguing in the context of Arunachal. Like each of the states, the ethno-federal positions are different. So there are dominant tribes, there are smaller tribes. So each state has a different situation. So, but the Indian state, for instance, does not recognize indigeneity. Like it does not say any people are indigenous. There's an ethno-federal provision within the Indian state, which is an argument which I agree to, because indigeneity is also a particular concept that has a burden of like a global discourse of who are the original people who came here first. Like, was there settler colonialism? So when you do not really have a history of settler colonialism, but different histories of marginalization probably beginning with the colonial state of exclusion, production of remoteness, all of these. I don't know how useful it would be to use the language of indigeneity moving forward, because I mean, for instance, ethno-federal provisions as minority rights, that makes sense to some extent, but there can be debates about who can have it, like what is representation, like how do we, it's a much more fluid concept. But when we talk about indigeneity, it is actually quite a dangerous concept if it's like assumed in its essential form. So, which is why I do not use the language of indigeneity, given the historical burden and the different historical context in South Asia. So yeah.
Is there anyone who'd like to ask a question? Indrajit, Buddhadev, or anybody else who is there?
I don't have a question per se, but I suppose I should put it out there and leave it, for whoever wants to pick it up. But just in response to Noel, your comment, as well as the specific comment that has come in the chat box, I mean, there is something to be said about the multiple vulnerabilities that members of different communities suffer in India. And of course, this is part of the graded inequalities thing that comes with caste, but there is also beyond and outside of the caste hierarchy, there are multiple sufferings or vulnerabilities or marginalizations that different groups have to face. And it is, of course, always a challenge for liberal democracies to accommodate those different claims and those different demands. And perhaps sometimes liberalism may be the problem rather than the solution. That is, you reduce things to liberal individuals and then you try and sort of abstract out the social positions. The alternative, of course, is not pleasant. And I'm not suggesting that the alternative to liberal democracies is civil war or violence. But I think there is some degree of conflict And when I say conflict, I don't mean violent conflict necessarily, but conflict of resources, conflict of ideas that states which have multicultural populations cannot escape. So my solution, I don't have a solution, and that's the easy bit here, but I think one has to think about institutionalizing conflict rather than pretending that conflict doesn't exist, so that then it just spills out of hand. But and I think in that respect, Noel, your thoughts on, or well, not your thoughts, but the way you talked about ethno-federal sort of arrangements might come closest, where you recognize that each state is unique and each state has its unique configuration of problems, not pretend that indigenous or scheduled tribe or tribal, let's say, whatever term you might use, is sort of one homogeneous term, but you recognize the various vulnerabilities and not run away from. And I think one of the problems that liberal discourse, howsoever defined, has faced is that we think we must take a position one way against the other, whereas that may not always be possible in the situation of multiple vulnerabilities that people face. But anyway, I mean, that was just more of a, to put out there. I don't expect an immediate response or even a rebuttal, hopefully.
So anyone has got a kind of response to the comment, or?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a direct response to the comment, but it was actually going back to what you said about, how we remember partition or how we talk about partition. The question of who is or isn't a refugee or a citizen in various parts of India cannot be delinked from what is Bangladesh as a state and what is Bangladesh's relationship to India, right? So, whether it's in Tripura or Arunachal or Assam or Delhi, when people are saying send them back, they're sending them back to this country, right? And this country is housing close to 1 million Rohingya refugees as well, while also facing a massive climate crisis. So it's just interesting to me that in the dialoguing about the citizenship question of India, we're not really talking directly about what we are imposing on Bangladesh or what we are asking of Bangladesh while it is in this very precarious position. When I say we, I don't know who I'm really talking about, the government, of course, but I think also civil society and individuals. Like, there's this intertwining of the fates of these two countries that India, as the big brother, has never really acknowledged, and it's putting Bangladesh in an extremely difficult situation. And I think it's sort of incumbent upon those of us who work on this issue to be more cognizant about that and to be more, to kind of consciously bring Bangladesh into this conversation as well.
I just have a follow-up comment on this Bangladesh thing. One of the things that has disturbed me, it's really funny in a sense. On the one hand, if you look at Hindu Right, takes a lot of credit for Bangladesh liberation. You see, when Prime Minister Modi said that he was arrested and he'd gone protest, and Vajpayee was the person who primarily is responsible for the creation of Bangladesh, not Indira Gandhi, as we all grew up hearing about it. Now, on the one hand, we take so much of pride for the creation of Bangladesh. On the other hand, we don't want to give basic dignity to some of the people, the poorest of the poor, who migrate to India. We all know who migrates to India. If the poorest of the poor Bangladeshis who manage to migrate to Europe or other parts of the world, they try their best to go to the other parts of the world. I'm sure all of us have met such people in Europe, in England, in US. They are not really, take graduates who are migrating to US and UK. They work in restaurants and do all kinds of things about it. So it's a very strange thing about this Hindu Right. Why is it that if you are taking so much of pride, and then you say that India is a country which has tolerated all cultures, this and that, and all this narrative about Indian history, and then you say that no, we don't want all these guys about it at all. I just have another question to Antara and Shreya particularly, and Indrajit can, or Buddha can also. Looking at this discussion from Bidisha's analysis of Diaspora's response to the CAA, is there a difference that those of you who work in UK the UK diaspora any differently reacted to this whole issue as opposed to American diaspora. And because, one of the observations that she made that Indians, who believe in diversity and pluralism in America are supporting majoritarianism over there. My own sense is this: a lot of Indians who go to America, they not go there because they want to promote a value system. They want to make America more diverse and plural and tolerant. They just go there because they believe in almighty dollar. And, almighty dollar would kind of solve the problems. It's more for careers and opportunities. It's the Americans who wanted to, many of them get jobs because of diversity and all of that. So that's an American project in which they become the beneficiary of it. It's not that the value system is deeply ingrained and all of that. You can blame the American system for failing to recognize whether these people are indeed not a part of it. So if there is a difference in the diasporic response, it's the same kind. Do we see?
I think Shreya, Antara, and Rudhabe, they have raised their hands. Yep.
I can start if that's okay. To the point in diasporic response, I was in India when the CAA protests were happening, so I have a better idea of how people were reacting there. However, I was doing a project on seeing how CAA and NRC protests were organized across the globe, and especially Europe. There were a bunch of Twitter organizations that came up, and often the title or the username they would have is India against, or Indians outside wherever they are, / against NRC CAA. And this is something which is noticeable in the protests, especially not in the Northeast, is what was anti-CAA NRC protest soon translated into anti-Modi Shah protest. And you see a similar tone in the web on all of these Twitter feeds that are organizing protests outside the country. Often it's anti-CAA NRC / anti-Hindutva, anti-Modi Shah. So this sort of discourse also, especially in the diaspora, it counters the rising religious nationalism, but it also simultaneously peripheralizes these sort of dynamics that further this sort of rising nationalism from the Northeast. So that is one, I think, in terms of like diaspora that I could say. But I also wanted to reply on the conversation on tribal / indigeneity, and especially the question that's come up. And I think it says marginalized tribal groups, right? Which is the question, which groups are we counting as quote unquote tribal? So for example, with the Assam movement coming up, during the Assam movement itself, there was a book by a renowned Assamese scholar who said that we indigenous population feel very insecure with the rise of foreigners who intend on taking over our land, taking over. Powerful groups who intended taking over. Bengali Hindus want to establish a sort of linguistic hegemony, whereas Bengali Muslims want to establish a religious hegemony, right? And it's interesting to see how the foreigner here is a powerful group. Now, over the period of time, the foreigner now becomes a landless migrant, a peasant. So there is a more sympathy, but the sympathy is evoked also in the sense to justify the necessary evil of their expulsion. So we see this in a recent article that came out in 2019 by another very famous, renowned Assamese scholar who says that, well, and I will be countering Noel's argument about settler colonialism. In case of Assam, it does matter because here in the argument, the very established, renowned Assamese social scientist says that, let me invoke two horrors. And he talks about Native Americans in the US and he talks about Israel. And then he says, let us not give our generosity and pity to all landless migrants or to all poor migrants. So the idea of settler colonialism, the language is repeated at least when it comes to Assam, if not in Arunachal Pradesh. But definitely when it comes to Assam, a particular socioeconomic class uses or borrows the language of settler colonialism to say that we have seen what settler colonialism has done there and we do not want it here. Which again goes on to raise the point that this indigeneity discourse, which has been borrowed with all its fractions, then produces a sort of competitive precariousness amongst different indigenous groups who now compete on who's indigenous enough. So right after the Assam movement, there was the Bodos movement, and simultaneously there was a conflict in southern Assam between the Dimasas and the Karbis. So this suddenly it is a ripple effect in which becomes which tribal groups are we talking about, and should we rank them who's precarious enough, and on that basis we should institutionalize a sort of liberal institution, right? So it is a very difficult question, because it becomes a sort of competition rather than a collective unified effort in sharing that precarity. So when we talk about an institutional liberal system, these are divisions we need to figure out, because the system as of now incentivizes competition rather than collective action. So that is one point. But going back to the first question, actually I wanted to answer a lot of them. So the first question on partition, it's interesting that you talk about the interpretation, because just this year during partition, Modi came up with the Remembering Partition Horrors Day, right? It's very interesting because partition in this language, horror, right? Horror is a very emotive word to use. And it goes back to the idea about how we've lost something in partition, or how devastating it was. And it was, but it forgets the fact that partition in Punjab was very different from partition in Bengal. And rather, partition in Bengal was not even the partition of just Bengal, but a lot of groups across the Northeast, in where the process was much more slower and relatively less violent, where there is still excessive mobility. Rather, the border allows a lot of groups to negotiate state nation making on both sides of the border. So the border has a lot of utility as well for the communities that it has divided. So when we have something like Partition Horror Day, we not only present or monopolize over the discourse of how gruesome partition was, but we also present borders as necessarily evil rather than productive spaces or affective spaces that also produce a lot of connections instead of just divisions. So yeah, those are the three things I wanted to pick up. I'm sorry for putting too much out there.
Thank you, sir. Professor Datta?
Right. So just picking up on Shreya's point about how different groups are using these various pivotal moments. Actually, if we think about Bangladesh's place in India's imagination, what the Assamese are trying to do is, look, 1971 is a really peculiar moment, because in West Bengal, there is resentment against the refugees who are coming in, particularly as they get closer to the big cities, there is resentment. But there is also this moment of linguistic solidarity, right? And although, as I said, I disagree with Professor Devji about why India goes to war, India is using a humanitarian discourse. I would argue it's not using it to go to war, but it's certainly using it to promote a certain sense of moral superiority. So what Assam does in this period is it uses that moment to create a security discourse about Bangladesh, right? So it uses the refugee influx of 1971 to create a security discourse where it demands that it be that Assam's problems, as it were, be taken much more seriously. So it argues that what is a local feud, if you will, is actually deserves central attention because it is a national security issue. So your landless Bangladeshi peasant is in fact a threat to the Indian center. He is not just a threat to the unity of Assam, but the Assamese are arguing that if you don't deal with this, that somehow he will tear the fabric of India apart. Right. So in the Indian imagination, what I think is really interesting is the transition of Bangladesh from this sort of helpless country that needs our help, which is how most people seem to remember 1971, with sort of no acknowledgement of the role of, say, the Mukti Bahini or any other actors, to a kind of pivot to where now Bangladesh is not only the producer of refugees, but is almost as much of a security threat through its migrants as Pakistan is on the western border. Right, and so I would argue that sort of transition takes place in the Indian imagination, and particularly in the imagination of the Hindu right. To answer the question about Indians in the UK, I actually spent the last couple of years in the entire period of the CAA protest in the United States, on the East Coast in Boston. So I wasn't here in the UK, but actually the discourse about citizenship rights for Indians here took a really peculiar turn during Brexit, of course, right? Which sort of kind of coincided, as sort of Brexit was becoming more of a reality, it was, the CA movement was taking off, and many Indians here, many in the diaspora voted for Brexit because they saw themselves as second-class citizens to these European migrants. And somehow they thought that, well, if we get rid of them, it will be easier for our people to come over. Clearly that was some sort of fiction that the Tory party was able to sell, or the Leave campaign was able to sell. But I think it's important to note that because, again, obviously there are those who take part in kind of civil society, who have a more pluralistic vision of India, but certainly within the UK diaspora, which I would argue is possibly a little bit more economically diverse than the US Indian diaspora for historical reasons, I think there is, that kind of the counter movement or pro-Hindutva movement would have had perhaps greater sway. The one thing I will say is that one of the reasons why some people who are pro-Hindutva and who were also, who are possibly even pro-Modi, paused to think about the NRCCA in particular, and I'm talking about immigrants, is that, what I talked about right at the beginning, this kagoje ratonko, this fear of documentation and bureaucracy. All immigrants fear it, right? All immigrants intimately understand the fear of the bureaucracy. So even those who are pro-Modi and pro-CA did understand the fear of being without documentation or having a documentation not be recognized overnight, right? So while they may not have come out onto the streets protesting against the NRCCA, I think there was a sort of implicit understanding that there was something inherently unfair about that piece of legislation, right? Even, as I said, even if they weren't going to go and protest about it.
We can't hear you, Mujib. I think you need to unmute.
Dr. Udave Sahid, Dr. Sahid, would you unmute? Yeah.
Sorry, my video is not turning on, but that's fine. I'm actually outside. I just wanted to ask a question, or rather even comment on the issue, the angle of international relations between India and Bangladesh. I mean, has been pointed out by one of the panelists that about this big brother attitude of the bigger neighbor, of course, and not considering that there are more than 1 million Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, and also issues of climate change. But I think there's also the issue of relations with China. Over the last few years, China is now the biggest trade partner with Bangladesh, which wasn't the case before, with India, of course. On the other hand, there's also, from Bangladesh, Indians also send a lot of remittances back home. In fact, the 4th largest source of remittance. So with this NRC-CAA drumming up, there are really 2 issues. One is it might get unsafe at one point for foreigners from the neighboring country to be in Bangladesh. I mean, that can be elaborated on. Of course, it hasn't reached that stage. The second thing is, of course, the Indian nationals working in Bangladesh, they're not doing any blue-collar jobs, they're doing white-collar jobs. And now there's also visible presence of China. So in this case, can we see a scenario where, say, Indian doctors working in the big hospitals, private hospitals in Dhaka, being replaced by the Chinese or even Vietnamese and all that? Because Bangladesh is actually looking at other sources of building relations because of these issues. I wouldn't say a fallout with India, but definitely the government-to-government relations is pretty good, but they're actually looking at other partners. That's my question and comment.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that comment. Dr. Biswas, would you like to elaborate on your comment on the India not even considering the dignity of state of Bangladesh? Would you like to add anything to that?
No, I mean, I think it was just a very interesting component of the CAA NRC that, on the one hand, is, as was just discussed, the Modi government takes a lot of pride in Bangladesh, and on the other hand, it kind of sticks it to Bangladesh without even, advanced memo, so, I completely agree with what Professor Shai just said. And I think Bangladesh is wise to seek out other partners, because this partnership is not, it's not doing well.
All right. So, well, I think, are we very close to time? I think we can conclude with the final thoughts from the panelists about the future of CAA movement. How many of you believe that CAA would resurface and could pose an equal or bigger threat to the Modi Shah regime? How many of you are optimistic about it, both domestically and globally? I mean, I'm sure that the intellectual movement will go on. I'm talking about the political side of it.
Well,
like
sorry, go ahead. Yeah, I'm not hugely optimistic, but I'm a pessimist anyway. I think what I finished with last time, which is that there is an inherent understanding in India that, it is an unfair piece of legislation and it will make lives difficult for very many people. So one of the interesting things that comes out in the debates is that there's this MP from Tamil Nadu who basically talks about how one of her constituents marries an Assamese man. And because all her documentation is based in Tamil Nadu, she then under the NRC is unable to prove her Indian citizenship, right? And this MP is saying, but it's absurd. Why should my constituent be asked to prove her, her citizenship just because she married an Assamese man and now lives in Assam? And I think there is an understanding that if this becomes reality, this is going to be a mess, right? So there is there's a pragmatic understanding of it. But I think politically, what the BJP was playing was sort of balancing doing a very fine balancing act in the last Assam elections, right? Because the CAA is not popular with the Assamese Hindu voters, right? But they did okay actually, and they did particularly well in the Barak Valley, etc. So and they did well in the elections. So my pessimistic suspicion is that eventually the BJP will sacrifice the Assamese voter for greater glory among the Hindu voter at large in India, and at some critical moment will push the legislation through, but I guess time will tell.
Well, as a political scientist, I've learned not to make predictions because they're usually wrong. But as someone who studies social movements, I would say that I do think that the government was taken aback by the force of protests, and they might well find other ways. I mean, this is there was a clear political agenda, or maybe a dual agenda, getting some votes in Assam and Bengal, which sort of worked, sort of didn't, and also advancing their exclusionary agenda. And there are other pathways to do that. So I think if they bring it back, it'll be a little bit slow. I honestly don't think they were prepared for the kind of backlash that this.
Yeah, it all depends on the Uttar Pradesh results and also the next parliamentary results. So
there's always a new outrage, right? I mean, that's the right-wing playbook everywhere. One day it's the evil refugee colonial settler, another day it's Imran Khan, who knows. So
a lot of scholars here in Delhi often say, oh, the Prime Minister has said this and Home Minister has withdrawn this, has made this statement, and I really don't take those things seriously because they have said all kinds of things. So can we now wind it up? Indrajit, what's the...
I mean, you're the boss, but I don't know if Noel and Shreya wanted to say some last words, famous last words, and then you should hand over to Filippo you should hand over to Buddha to thank everyone for this session, and then Filippo to give the vote of thanks. But
Noel and Shreya, you have to add, you have any final thoughts?
I don't have anything much to say, but the fact that because the major debates are surrounding the CA and the Hindutva, when we actually look at other communities like Tibetans, like Sri Lankans or Rohingyas who've been excluded from the CA, and we look at other borders that are not Muslim majority countries, I think other narratives about the CA I think like we would have to look at plural narratives about what the CAA is and like uncover it, like, because I feel it's not just like a Hindutva plan, because this is something that's like a much more structural logic of like the nation state, like irrespective of whether it was the BJP or I don't know if it would have been any other party, but like it, I feel it's a much more complex process that's going on. That's just like what I think.
All right, Shreya?
I would just further what Noel said. Like, if you think about the Gorkhas, for example, in West Bengal, and Noel has read the book as well because it was in a slide. On demands for recognition, Townsend Middleton notes, he says how once he sent a survey in which they had to say when they came to Nepal, they came from Nepal, and everyone got angry, and they were like, we don't say that. We know we came from Nepal, but we don't say that. Where does that fear come from? The idea of NRCCA is so prevalent, the idea of collecting documents and where you come from, showing that you have not come from ABC, is something that is dispersed. It doesn't just exist on the India-Bangladesh border. Now it is dispersed to the India-Nepal border to discuss. We don't talk about where we come from. Say in Jaipur, when there was a 2008 bomb blast, the people suspected to be Bangladeshis were beaten up and put into custodies. The police had forgotten to, the priority was not to look into the bombing or its perpetrators, but to collect and round up Bangladeshis who were suspected Bangladeshis and put them into jail to get rid of a Bangladeshi settler slum in the outskirts of Jaipur. So the border problems or the questions of who belongs and who does not belong has moved way beyond not just the border, but also the state machinery. People themselves have taken up actions to identify these suspected infiltrators. So if CAA, it will of course resurface, but in a very different form. If not a collective action as a nation, like we saw in 2019, it would be smaller instances. Like for example, what happened in Assam the last 2 days, my WhatsApp groups are already planning protests. It's not a nationwide protest, but it's a more smaller groups finding new ways of re-articulating what the problem of NRC tried to like identify and then distribute and disperse it into different forms of, again, political action, but not perhaps as cohesive as we saw in 2019.
Wonderful. So I think all of you agree that we had an excellent discussion on this particular question, and I'm just going to say my final remark on this, just responding to or furthering the comment of Dr. Biswas, which is, there's some who said that they just did not mention about Constitution. And, there is this lawmaker from BJP called Anant Kumar Hegde from Karnataka, who was minister in the first term of Modi government. He once said that we have not come here to save the Constitution, we have come here to change the Constitution. And he said this when he was a minister in the cabinet. And I always say, whenever I make a presentation on the BJP, I said he's the only man in BJP who speaks honestly. He's the one. So now I hand over Buddha to do the thanks, and then followed by Dr. Philip Oponi.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Rahman. I think this session is so moving. Like everyone speaks so well, and it was so engaging. So I like the session, and also Professor Mujibur Rahman, the way you have moderated it is really, excellent. Anyway, thank you all panelists, and thank you Noel, thank you Antara, thank you Bidisha, and also thank you. Now I would like to hand over to Filippo.
Thanks, and there are going to be a lot of thanks in the next couple of minutes. So, we're coming to a close, so bear with us and with me for another couple of minutes. As I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to say a few words as a way to express our gratitude to all those who have participated in the conference in various capacities. So today we had one keynote speech, one special panel on Afghanistan, 4 fantastic panels covering really the breadth and depth of some of the key issues surrounding citizenship in South Asia. We were really pleased, and this is something we discussed with the organizers in the run-up to the conference, that we were able to include scholars from, as well as research on, pretty much almost every South Asian country, almost. Which I think made this conference really all the more interesting and inclusive. And we had fantastic interest in terms of registration, very good attendance throughout the conference for all the panels. So really the first thank you goes to all those of you who have attended the conference and to our great speakers who presented today. We are very grateful to you in this final panel, as well as to those that have preceded you for sharing your time and expert insights with us. And I hope we will be really able to take some of these conversations forward in other settings and formats, and that really the vibrant debates that we had at today's conference, and that of course the wider project as well as generated will inform the scholarship on citizenship in South Asia in the coming months and years, hopefully. So again, thank you so much for sharing your research and your knowledge with us. Also, special words of thanks to Professor Faisal Devji for his keynote speech earlier today. Very provocative, wide-ranging, really fascinating and interesting talk. As you can imagine, an event which was somewhat of a marathon from 8:45 a.m. UK time to 7 p.m. in the evening would have not been possible without the participation and the work of many people. First of all, I would like to thank Indrajit, the principal investigator of the Reimagining Citizenship project, for his leadership throughout all the organization, and for suggesting the idea of working together on this great event together in the first place. So thanks very much to you, Indrajit. Dr. Rudabe Shahid has been another pillar of the organizing committee, and it was great to meet you as part of this process. And I mean, your inputs and suggestions have really contributed to making this conference the success that I think we can say it has been now that it's over. Dr. Budabe Halder has been really the beating heart of the organization machine. So special thanks to Buddha, because he's done a fantastic job. I mean, whatever you see today, it's pretty much, a lot of it is Buddha's work. So thank you so much, Buddha, and fantastic work in the past 2 months. It's been a pleasure. And once again, a massive thank you. Of course, Anam Qureshi, who's from the PSA South Asia side, who's helped us with some of the advertising as well. And once again, a massive thank you to